Okay. Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me if you're there. You can see we've just got a number of people coming through. I think everyone's been waiting in the waiting room, so it will just take a little bit of time for everyone to filter through. So we'll start in about a minute or so once everyone has come through from the waiting room. The participant ticker is still going up, so we'll give it until about minute or 2 minutes past 2 before we commence. Okay, so it looks like the majority of people have now come through. The ticker for participants has begun to slow down a little bit. So I think we'll kick off. So there we go. So thanks very much for joining us today for this afternoon's webinar, which will take about an hour or so. It's to look at how London waste services adapted to the COVID pandemic. Just a very brief introduction. I'm sure that most participants will know and be aware of who LWARB are and what we do, but we're a partnership between the Mayor of London and the London boroughs, helping London to transition to a low carbon circular economy, and we collaborate with businesses, government, waste authorities, the third sector and the London wider London community. Today, you're going to be hearing from the Resource London programme of LWARB, which is essentially LWARB's local authority support programme. And our objective is to support London to reduce the amount of waste that's produced and to recycle more of what remains. This is who we are as a team, and so hopefully many of you here listening today will be familiar with this Rose Gallery that's up in front of you, and you'll have met many of them in the past through various projects and activities that we deliver. So today you're going to be hearing from I should have introduced myself, I should have said. So my name is Anthony Buck and I'm the head of programme for Resource London at LWARB. And today you're going to be hearing from 3 members of the Resource London team. So first up, you're going to be hearing from Sarah Craddock, and she's going to be talking to you about some of the work that we have done looking at the impacts of COVID on the commercial waste sector. Then you'll hear from Kathy Cook, and she's going to talk about our London Learnings Report, which is a survey of the 33 London boroughs and the joint waste disposal authorities on the impact that COVID had on the delivery of their services and the lessons that they learnt. And finally, you'll hear from Gemma Scott on waste compositional changes as a result of COVID, for some work that we actually had planned, but that has given us some initial insights into the impacts that COVID has had. And then at the end, we've got some time for questions. I will do some questions directly after the presentations, but we will hold most of them to the end. I would ask that if you want to ask questions, you use the questions function within Zoom, which should appear down at the bottom of your screens rather than the chat function. I will try and keep an eye on both during the webinar, but it would be easier if you could use the questions function rather than the chat function. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Sarah Craddock, who is going to talk about commercial waste adaptation in response to COVID.
Thank you, Anthony. Just bear with me while I get my presentation up. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that, and apologies in advance for not having my video on today. So as Anthony said, I'm going to talk to you about commercial waste adaptation, and particularly around the future impact of COVID-19 on commercial waste in London, and this is around both volumes and composition. So a couple of months ago, we developed a project to look at the prediction of commercial waste volumes and composition that we expect to see across London as a result of COVID-19. The target audience for this was London local authorities, and the key questions we looked to answer were around differences in commercial waste that we'd see between large companies and SMEs, how composition of volumes would differ between inner London boroughs and outer London boroughs, particularly in terms of the differences that we see between them in residential numbers and high work destinations. And then we also wanted to look at the impact government restrictions and interventions would have on commercial waste. And within the project, we considered different things such as economic interventions, lockdown restrictions, but also behaviour change of residents and workers within London. So this research was commissioned by LWARB and it's completed by Eunomia. And as part of the project, they conducted a range of interviews with local authorities, private waste contractors, and also businesses. They completed baselining to inform the modelling, and this came from various sources, including existing DEFRA waste data and surveys, national composition data from RAP, and also business register employment surveys from ONS. And a key limitation of the project was actually around the data. So commercial waste data isn't readily available in great detail, as you do get for residential data. So the baseline had to be informed using these existing sources. And there were quite a few assumptions made around it, which I'll come to a bit later on in more detail. So through the interviews with local authorities, we discovered that they saw a drop in tonnage between 60 and 90% in April this year, but that drop had actually gone down. So they were seeing a drop of 25 to 35% in July. So they were starting to sort of return back to their normal volumes. They didn't have a large number of customer cancellations, but they did get a high number of contract change requests, which required a high level of resource from their teams. They saw reduced demand for DMR. This was believed to be because of the time it takes to segregate recycling versus the cost benefit of it, but there was an increased demand for food waste collections, and similar to the DMR reductions, the cost benefit for segregating out food waste outweighed the cost of time to segregate it. Local authorities found that they had to start operating their services very flexibly, but they were also able to actually win a new amount of business from private waste contractors. And this was particularly where private waste contractors weren't able to operate efficiently. We found that the local authorities were able to use spare crew for commercial waste collections, and their commercial waste vehicles redeployed to other council collections such as household, which helped to drive their efficiencies that private waste contractors didn't see. And where local authorities co-collect their household and commercial waste, they were able to still run full vehicles and complete their rounds. But overall, for this financial year, local authorities are predicting a 15 to 20% drop in commercial waste revenue. And then when talking to businesses, we found that business activity for supermarkets, pharmacists and food and drink manufacturers was generally unaffected, and in some cases it did increase. Businesses that rely on key trade from workers saw a large decline in their activity. So, this included gyms and hotels as well, and that's hotels of all sizes. But there was no significant change to composition other than PPE, cleaning and our hygiene wastes. And even though some businesses saw a large increase in these, it wasn't expected to have a great impact on overall commercial waste volume, just due to the weight of these materials. And then in discussion with the private waste contractors, they experienced similar tonnage drops to that from local authorities. And the key areas where they had the biggest impact were those, again, with a high business concentration, as would be expected, key tourist destinations such as Westminster, and those that are reliant on visitor access by public transport. So private waste contractors also moved to offering flexible collections for their customers and changed their charging methodology where needed. There's a key customer account of private waste contractors are essential retailers, hospitals and healthcare customers. And similar to those supermarkets and pharmacists, they haven't seen key changes to their volumes of commercial waste over and during lockdown. And then just to sort of talk you through the tonnage changes by sector. So once the baseline was completed, there was forecasting done for each local authority, and this was then wrapped up into London-wide figures. So proportion-wise, the sectors seeing the biggest percentage reduction are public administration and social work, so they've dropped by 58%. Accommodation and food services has dropped by 49%. But actually the largest tonnage decrease is in the other services sector. So other services incorporate things such as office-based staff and smaller independent businesses such as nail bars and estate agents. So it's predicted that between last financial year and this financial year, tonnage for this sector will fall by almost 300,000 tonnes. And then to look at the tonnage changes by waste type, and just to clarify, this is the type of waste that's produced, so not how it's collected. So for example, food waste could be food in a segregated food collection, or it could be food waste that's seen in a residual bin. So there's a relatively similar pattern across all waste types, so they all fall between 22 and 36%. The largest drops tonnage-wise are going to be in food waste, which is almost 400,000 tonnes lower, and also paper and card by just over 300,000 tonnes. And this is expected to be due to the particularly hard hit that the hospitality sector and the office sector have both seen during lockdown. So as I mentioned at the start, we tried to look at the differences between inner and outer London. So local authorities, or the majority of outer London local authorities, will see less of an impact on their waste arising than those in inner London. Those that are going to see the biggest decreases in commercial waste, so over a 32% decrease, are all based in inner London. And the 8 of the top 10 largest decreases are forecast to take place in inner London. And looking at the map, you can see very clearly that Westminster City and Tower Hamlets will be the hardest impacted. Westminster, a lot of businesses, but also a huge tourist destination. City is obviously mostly commercial waste, not a large number of residents. And Tower Hamlets, even though there are a large number of residents within Tower Hamlets, they also have Canary Wharf and that surrounding business area. So a lot of commercial waste that will be dropped from those offices. And then overall, predicted rises in unemployment are likely to have the biggest impact on non-essential in-store retail, accommodation and food sectors. And even though the report couldn't look in detail at waste composition because of the baseline data, we did find some expected changes. So the hospitality and food sector will see a substantial decrease in food and glass. Non-essential in-store retail, we expect to see reduced cardboard arisings from these, but that may actually be offset by increased activity in the essential retail sector. So overall, that waste type may remain stable. And then obviously a significant decrease in paper from the office sector. And I just want to talk through the limitations briefly as well. So as I mentioned at the start, there are a lot of limitations with the project, mostly around the data. So commercial waste data is very limited and it is formed from a lot of estimations. And similarly with that, the ONS business surveys, even though they do provide a lot of detail, business numbers don't necessarily equal commercial waste contracts. So we had to make assumptions around business numbers within a borough that would have active commercial waste production. There's also a number of other unknowns that complicated the project. So how much of the commercial waste has disappeared completely and how much has actually moved into household tonnage with people moving to working from home. And then there's projections regarding the future business activity that are uncertain because there's other things that are happening in the world, such as Brexit. And also there's an ever-changing landscape. So just in the last 2 weeks of actually writing the project, there are numerous different changes and interventions introduced by the government, such as the Rule and 6 and the closing of hospitality businesses by 10 o'clock. And then since the report was published, We had the tier system introduced, London moved into tier 2, and now we're in national lockdown again, so lockdown 2.0. So a key issue with this project is just the timing of it. So the report that's available to download just to remember that's written at a set point in time, and we're aware that a lot has changed since then, but it's hard to keep track of everything when it keeps moving so quickly. And then I just wanted to add on about lockdown 2.0. So I had a meeting with a number of local authorities yesterday, and there's some sort of 3 key observations that I drew from that meeting. And so they're seeing that there's fewer suspension requests this time round, but they're still getting a lot of contract downgrades from businesses. Boroughs are finding that the way that they adapted their services to be more flexible during the first lockdown is actually making this one slightly easier to manage for them. And they're also finding that businesses are being more proactive. So in the first lockdown, they had to constantly chase businesses and try and find out whether they still wanted waste collections, whereas this time the businesses are actually getting in touch with the council to amend their service, which makes things easier to manage, but obviously requires a higher resource. I think the last message that I just want to sort of share is that there's still great uncertainty from the boroughs, and this is particularly if lockdown is extended into, well, extended further. That's me.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Sarah, can I ask you just to continue to just share your slides for 1 second? Because we just had one question in which is point of clarity, which would just be helpful just to come back to. So if you could just go back to your slide 7, which was the no, slide 8. Apologies.
Yep.
So we've had a question in about the waste reduction or the drop in tonnage. I think the question is probably around, so the question is that London is looking like it might have a 300,000 tonne reduction in commercial waste, but the slide seems to imply there'll be a 400,000 tonne drop in food waste. That might be not something that we can answer today, but these are our projections based on the waste tonnage. Is that something that you're able to talk to, Sarah?
I will have to double check the figures, and I can come back at the end of the presentations.
That'd be great. Thanks, Sarah. That'd be really helpful. Okay, great. Thank you for that, Sarah. You know, I've heard it a number of times. I've read the report, but I still find it really interesting to think about how COVID is going to impact on the commercial waste sector. And as Sarah mentioned, just want to reiterate that it is a complete movable feast. So when we were writing this report, we had to have multiple iterations on almost a day-to-day basis as the government changed the rules or things changed throughout the development of this report, which meant it took a lot longer than we expected to try and be able to produce this report. But hopefully, you know, the insights that Sarah's just said there will whet your appetite slightly to go and have a look at the full report, and I would commend you all to do that. I'm going to pass over now to Kathy Cook, and Kathy's going to talk about the London Learnings Report based on the survey that we did of the 33 London Waste Authorities and the 4 Joint Waste Disposal Authorities and SLWP. And again, I just ask if you do have any questions, if you can post those in the question function. Kathy, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anthony. I'm just going to share my screen. Right. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay. So everyone can see that, yeah?
Yes, Kathy.
Sorry, I didn't hear anybody. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, yeah, afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Sarah, for that presentation. As Anthony mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the project that we did with relating to domestic waste. And we've called it the London Learnings Report, how local authority waste services responded during the COVID-19 pandemic. So mine was slightly easier than Sarah's in that it was a set timescale that we looked at rather than sort of ever-changing landscape. So firstly, why did we look at doing this? We wanted to see how local authorities fared during the main timescale of the pandemic. So we looked at sort of between March and May this year. And we wanted to learn what local authorities did in order to gain learnings for future COVID-19 restrictions. Now, at the time when the project started to be conceptualised, it was around June, July time. So we didn't actually know that we would definitely go into a second lockdown, but I think we had an idea that probably going into the winter season and, you know, potentially the flu season, that, you know, there could potentially be some further restrictions. So we thought it would be useful to gain some insight from what happened during the first lockdown, to see what local authorities did, what worked, what they would do differently, and what they would advise others to do. We carried out 97 interviews in total across all local authorities, so that's waste collection authorities and waste disposal authorities, and as Anthony said, the South London Waste Partnership. We looked at both household waste and commercial waste collection and disposal, and also the communications. We had a few different themes as well. So we looked at resources, so both staffing and vehicles, their general services, so sort of curbside and flats collection, and also obviously commercial collection, operations and policies, the communications, and we also asked them about the London Recycles assets, which I'll come on to talk about a bit later, and the LWARB support channels. So we developed a couple of areas of support, and we wanted to know how and if local authorities had used those and how they found them. So I'm just going to quickly go through some key learnings and recommendations from the report. And the first thing that came out of it was to protect numbers of operational staff. So this is frontline staff delivering services. And we found that a lot of local authorities, if they had a commercial waste service, they transferred their staff from commercial waste to household waste for obvious reasons. Most of the commercial waste facilities were no longer required, or were much reduced because most businesses were closed. And also things like street scene services, other auxiliary services, so things like graffiti removal, that sort of thing. So to protect the numbers of operational staff where they were self-isolating or off sick, a lot of staff were moved from other services. And this is quite a key area because obviously the majority of services needed were for household waste. And it's advisable to look at exploring opportunities to multi-skill operational staff. So if, I mean, we're actually in a second lockdown now, and local authorities are faring very well, but if things should continue, by multi-skilling operational staff in order so they can do sort of both loading and driving and different tasks, and maybe street scene service staff where they can do different tasks on the vehicle. That helps to provide a lot more resilience in order to continue to keep the services going. Second finding was the upskilling of office staff. A lot of the waste officers mentioned that they didn't have a lot of time to engage with external support. So the sorts of support that we were providing, which I'll speak about later, and also the communications materials that we developed, a lot of them said that, you know, we just didn't have time. We just felt so snowed under with everything. You know, we were in this kind of bubble. So it could be a good idea to upskill other office staff, those that are maybe more on the periphery of the waste service, you know, those that are sort of maybe customer services staff. So they at least have some more knowledge and experience to support the waste team. So maybe they could go and view the platforms, they could help with the communication side of things. The London Recycling Officers Group, LWARB, you know, there's normally a 2 or 3 months meeting for those. So maybe different staff could go along, just so you're sort of spreading the skills a little bit more, again, to develop a bit more resilience. Keep HWRCs open, and this has actually obviously happened this time in lockdown. So the majority of everyone we spoke to closed their HWRCs, apart from one that remained open to trade waste only, but they were all closed to residential waste. So since reopening, obviously systems such as online booking have been implemented, and they've all shown to be really, really good systems in order to maintain social distancing, etc. But pretty much all respondents reported that if lockdown measures were introduced again, and obviously this was, remember, back in July, August they were speaking, that they would seek to keep HWRCs open, and that's exactly what they've done. We got the impression that the reopening was so problematic. I mean, it went smoothly at the end, but it was quite problematic. So it was actually easier, they thought in hindsight, to just keep them open and allow people, you know, to come in, but obviously on a much more limited basis. The use of digital communications. So lots of various types of communications were used, but like most people said that digital communications, particularly Twitter and Facebook, were far more effective. Hard copy materials, you know, that you can't update them regularly. And I think the thing with the COVID crisis, it was so unprecedented and it was changing on a daily basis that obviously digital communications and social media, you can just update really, really quickly. Hard copy materials just aren't as effective. And also authority websites, they felt that they weren't as effective either. The London Recycles campaign, there's a few examples in that bottom right hand corner of things that were produced. So there was a number of key digital assets. However, not all were used due to time constraints and branding. So the time constraint issue kind of goes back to the second point we said about upskilling office staff. A lot of waste management, waste team officers were saying they just didn't have the time. Literally their head was just in a bubble and they just didn't have the time to do anything. So by upskilling other office staff, you know, it could be useful for them to look at these assets, be able to use them, that sort of thing. They were developed and they were just there to share, and they were easily rebrandable. So rather than developing new assets straight from scratch, they were just very easy and easy to use. And a lot of authorities did talk about their own branding. And again, these are really easy to update. They can be rebranded. And I understand a lot of local authorities do like to use their own branding, but I think in circumstances such as this, where, you know, it did reach sort of crisis point a few times, maybe something like that just needs to be put aside and rethought. Working together, this is just a screenshot of the Slack channels that LWARB developed. So respondents valued the ability to be able to reach out to colleagues. So obviously across London, everybody's in the same situation. You know, they've got different services, but they've got very similar questions and, you know, things that they want to share. So we established a Slack workspace quite early on, almost sort of straight away at the beginning of April, sort of end of March time. And everyone said that was really, really useful because you could just very quickly put a question on, and lots of people, like I say, they were all going through very, very similar things. And they proved very popular. So we are actually looking at how we can maybe keep those going. They are still live at the moment, but obviously they've sort of not been used so much in the last few months. But we want to continue to keep those going because we feel that, you know, there's obviously potentially more restrictions coming along, and also just sharing ideas post-COVID as well. We feel like it's just going to be a much better workspace. So post-project, as of November, so last week we did a brief sort of call around of a few local authorities, and we spoke to about 20. Very, very simple questions, just asking them about their services. All but one local authority, who've just temporarily suspended the bulky, have confirmed that there are no changes to their services. And I think overall, it's fair to say that by speaking to the local authorities for this project and getting all the answers and results through, local authorities, London local authorities, fared extremely well in very, very difficult circumstances. There was a point where pretty much all HWRCs and bulky were closed, you know, were suspended. But overall, they fared really well. And I think local authorities have learned a lot from the first lockdown. And I think as a result, many of them have managed to maintain their services this time round. Most indicated they've got business continuity plans. So I think that was a really good opportunity to get those developed. So obviously there are things that they can follow if circumstances changed. And 4 local authorities did specifically mention, again, that less prioritized services, so bulky waste, street scene, you know, graffiti removal, that type of thing, would be suspended if resourcing became a problem. So that kind of fits in with our first finding of protecting and maintaining operational staff and prioritising curbside services. So prioritising residual and recycling services from the curbside and from flats. And I think that's me. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, so there are no questions coming in at the moment. So either we've astounded everyone, or with the findings, or everything makes sense. But as I say, if you do have questions, then please do put them through. I'm going to pass on finally to Gemma, who is going to talk very briefly about some initial findings we have on waste comp analysis as a result of an opportunity that arose for us to look at that. So over to you, Gem.
Hi, good afternoon. So yes, as Anthony said, I'm just going to talk you through some of the initial findings that we have found from a rerun of some waste composition analysis that we have conducted over the past few years. Before I talk you through that though, I just wanted to, I appreciate that a lot of you who are listening will know about the FLATS project that we've been running, but there will also be some of you that don't either. So I just wanted to summarise the project, because it will give you quite a lot of context into the rest of the waste composition analysis data. So as I said, many of you will know that over the past 3 years, LWARB ran one of the most comprehensive evidence-based projects I think ever conducted in the UK, actually, into how to improve recycling in purpose-built flats. The project used 12 case study estates. They were all Peabody estates, so social housing estates, in 6 inner London boroughs. And it was really to find out what changes that we could make for residents on the ground that would actually have the biggest impact in getting people to recycle more of their waste from home. We evaluated the performance of the project over the period of the 2 years using a blend of waste composition analysis, tonnage monitoring and stakeholder feedback. So as I said, it was really important. It was a strong evidence-based project. So those different evaluation methodologies were really important to bring together so that we actually had something to say. And the findings were that the project showed that improving how the bin areas looked and ensuring that there was good communication with residents had the biggest impact on increasing recycling rates. And we saw kind of 26% recycling increases, capture rates of increasing by 22%, and decreases in contamination of around 24%. So that's just giving you a little bit of background to the project itself, so that the rest of this makes some sense to you all. As I said, as part of the project evaluation, we conducted what is probably the most extensive waste composition analysis of flats ever in the UK. We actually conducted waste composition analysis on just over 1,600 households across those 12 case study estates. And that consisted of 3 weeks of waste composition analysis. So there was a pre-period in June 18. Just after we rolled out the interventions, we did another week in November 2018. And at the end of the project, so a year after it had started, we did another set of waste comp. And now, we've literally just finished the 4th set of waste composition analysis. It's worth saying that the pre, so the June 18 and the post, which the June 19, also included eight weeks worth of tonnage monitoring as well. And that the waste composition analysis looked at the residual, the dry mixed recycling, as well as food, where the estates had those. And there's just some photos there of kind of the waste composition analysis in action. The next couple of slides just give you a flavour of the kind of data that we collected during that process. So this is the data from June 19, so at the end of the project, showing the kind of the capture rates. So the black percentages here is the capture rate at the end of the project, and the green numbers there is the increase from the beginning of the survey, beginning of the project, before we actually inputted any interventions into the estates to after. So you can see some really good improvements there, but just giving you a flavour really of what the information was that we gathered. That's just giving you another indication of the kind of data that we looked at. There's a pie chart there of the total waste composition back in June of last year as well. So coming on to COVID-19 waste composition. So we were in a really lucky position, obviously, where we had really great, high quality, historic data on these properties. And we already had the budget set aside to rerun the waste comp analysis that we'd run last year to better understand the impact of the original recycling project over time. So that original project. Obviously, COVID-19 happened, which actually delayed the original waste composition analysis. So we decided to use it as an opportunity, really, to understand what the impact had been of COVID-19 on waste composition in those flats, and to kind of test hypotheses that kind of were flying around our virtual office around increases in food, increases in cards, and then risings in generally, which we were hearing from the boroughs, from yourselves. So we conducted the most recent week of waste composition analysis in mid-October. So we've just literally completed it to ensure, and the reason we did it in October was to make sure that it was representative as possible of what we're calling the kind of new normal. So i.e. the kids are back at school, people are working from home, so the kind of new normal. We added some new categories into the category list, into the waste composition category list, to try and capture any of those new types of materials that we were getting as a result of COVID-19. So we had a new category of face masks and an additional category of any other COVID related waste. And as I said, we sorted through those on that basis. It's worth saying that we're at the really early stages at the moment of analysing the data, because as you can appreciate, we've only just collected it. But I'll talk you through some of the initial findings on the next slide, but we will be publishing more detailed findings before Christmas if you are interested. Just before I take you through some of the initial findings, I just felt it was important to make you aware that obviously this most recent waste composition analysis was conducted actually on only 10 of the 12 estates. And it's also worth saying that the estates are skewed towards social housing, although there are some blocks that are occupied as well. And therefore that is, it's not necessarily representative of London as a whole, but it will certainly give us a bit of an insight into what the impact of COVID-19 has been. So here are some of our initial findings. So you'll see there, obviously I was talking about us adding that additional category of looking at masks. So once we've had a look at that, and we've averaged it up for London. So on average, about 1 mask per household per week was being disposed of within the waste as a whole. 89% of those masks were finding their way into the residual bin, but quite worryingly, just over 10% of those were finding their way into the recycling bin. So clearly issues there around contamination of recycling. And then looking at how those numbers equate for London as a whole. So for Greater London, we're looking at around 3.5 million single-use masks per week that are being disposed of, which is a huge number. So that's some really interesting figures there. Total waste arisings in general have increased, and that's the same for both recyclable as it is for non-recyclable. I'm sure that won't be any mass surprise for you. Once we've got the data analysed in a bit more detail, we'll have a better idea of the numbers around that. We've had a significant increase in the risings, so the overall tonnage of glass bottles, but also in terms of the capture rate. So a lot of that is finding its way into the recycling bin, which is great. Not all of it. Staggering increases in cardboard risings from the data that we've seen so far. That's largely kind of online delivery boxes, rather than things like cereal packets, to just reflect the fact that people are getting a lot of what they used to buy in the shops via kind of online delivery services. And that there's been the kind of last thing to say really is that overall we have seen that there's been a quite significant increase in the capture rate of dry mix recycling, which is great to see. And as I said, there's further analysis ongoing, and we're hoping to bring you that just before Christmas. Thank you ever so much.
Great, thanks, Gemma. Gemma, if you can keep your video on for a couple of minutes, thanks. So there are a couple of just questions that have come through for you. The first thing I wanted to just ask you, actually, to clarify, because you didn't mention it there, was about food waste. So we have been hypothesizing, as I'm sure many will, that we were going to see massive increases in food waste as a result of the fact that everyone is eating at home, preparing food at home. But our initial findings are we're not seeing that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention it here just because we haven't kind of finished the analysis, but certainly some of the initial stuff, some of the initial data that we're seeing is bearing that out, Anthony. Yeah, that we're not seeing the big increases in food waste arising that maybe we might all have hypothesized.
Great. Okay. And then I think there's just one point. There's one question that's come through, which I'm going to address you in a sec. But I think one point to clarify as well around that PPE is obviously that 3.5 that we've extrapolated, 3.5 million that we've extrapolated out is obviously, you know, we have to put a heavy caveat around that in that we did a waste comp of 10 estates. So it's quite a big leap. And then also, I think probably the thing to say is that's what we're saying. If we were to extrapolate out that household data, that's what would be in household waste, as in directly collected from the household.
Yes.
That doesn't address the fact that obviously there's probably huge numbers of disposable masks and PPE appearing in street litter.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we possibly, if you were going to say you could extrapolate that number out for households, but it's a conservative number because it doesn't it doesn't relate to that where PPE is captured in other places.
Absolutely.
Or where it has to be used because of regulations. So I know that certain sectors have to use daily disposable masks, so we're not talking about that.
Yeah, I think it's just giving us an insight into what's potential, into what is in the waste stream now that wasn't before. And
then one question that has come in, and I should probably put a disclosure here in that when Gemma said we sorted through the waste, Gemma didn't mean us. Luckily, there was a team of people that did that. But Gemma, there was a question about how did we deal with that. I don't know if you're able to. How did they deal with that, with the issues? I think it's just to say around the health and safety aspect of doing a waste comp at this time.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously because it's a job, people are allowed to still do it, but basically they were having to be 2 meters apart. So the space that we needed for the waste comp analysis in October this year was slightly bigger than we had needed in every previous phase, because obviously they had to keep all of their staff 2 meters apart. They all had to have visors on as well. So
were there any issues with them handling the PPE in there?
Well, I think when it comes to waste composition analysis anyway, there's a really, really high importance given to PPE because they are handling waste from people's households. So nothing really additional, because they already wear all of the PPE that you would expect when you're dealing with kind of raw waste, as it were. It was more kind of the distance that people were having to stand at the tables when they were sorting.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jem. Sarah, if I can bring you back in, there are a couple of questions that have come through for you as well. And there was one, so I think you're going to come back on the question around tonnage. And then I think there's really a question to you as well about whether or not we're going to rerun the report or how we might use the data going forward, given as we move through the winter and these restrictions, how that might affect. So bring you back in on that, that'd be great.
Yep. So I did have a slight panic with the data question because I thought something had gone really wrong with our figures. But the question was asking if there's a 300,000 tonnage reduction in commercial waste for London, how can food waste be reduced by 400,000 tonnes? So the figures are correct. I think it's maybe just a miscommunication on my part during my presentation. So the drop of 300,000 tonnes is just for the other services sector. So that's things such as offices, and that 300,000 tonnes doesn't include every other business sector such as retail. It doesn't look at hospitality, it doesn't look at manufacturing or education sectors as well. So that's a very limited sector. So that's where that volume comes from. And in terms of extending the report, obviously, we do definitely want to carry on doing research into this and continuing to look at the impact that COVID is going to have on commercial waste, because it's such an important thing for us and for the boroughs. I mean, my sort of own opinion on it and personal view on it, based on the call that I had yesterday with a number of boroughs, is waiting to see what happens with this lockdown. So quite a few of them said yesterday that they're really struggling to predict or forecast for the rest of the year, because they don't know how long this lockdown is going to last. If it's going to last until December, it will have obviously an impact. If it's going to last until March, that impact will be much greater. So I think actually seeing where this lockdown takes us would allow the local authorities to have a better understanding of their services and how they're going to be operating up to the end of the financial year. And it will also allow for better economic forecasting in terms of what businesses are running and open and operating. So in short, we will continue it, but when and what that will look like is a bit unknown at the moment, as everything with COVID is.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Jem, there's a question from Patrick here. I think we've sort of answered it. We are at the initial stages of our analysis of the waste data. There's huge amounts of data that we've got, and we need to go in and really mine that and understand it. But I think the question was were there any counterintuitive results from the waste comp analysis, or were they broadly as expected? I think the main one was that one around the initial findings we're finding around food. Is that right? I think that was the main one that we were surprised about when we were looking at the headline data.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Anthony. That's the main one that we're finding.
Yeah, and I think.
We're wanting obviously the data for another reason as well, because obviously we want to understand the impact of the Peabody project that we had over the course of time. So there's a lot to go through as a result of that. So there may well be more that comes out that we found quite counterintuitive.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing to say on this waste comp analysis is it's not a waste comp analysis, as Gemma just to reiterate, it's not a waste comp analysis of when the hard lockdown measures were in place. Obviously, we couldn't do a waste comp analysis at that time. So it is this waste comp analysis of as close to the new normal as we can get. So children back at school, some industries were opened up again. So, you know, some hospitality sector industries, so gyms, hairdressers, restaurants, you know, the hospitality sector was all open again, open for business. And so that will have, that the changes that came in the beginning of November won't impact upon this waste comp. So actually, it's quite a good indication for us about what, if ways of working continue, if people continue to work from home going forward, it might give a really nice indication of what waste comp analysis is going forward. Final question, just Kathy, question for you, I think really is there much variation? I think this is possibly someone who doesn't work in London Waste Authority, so it's come from Darren. Is there much variation in the way local authorities collect different waste streams across London? I think we could probably do a whole presentation, a whole webinar on that in its own right, but
yeah, I think possibly you're referring, Darren, to the different types of collections. So obviously each local authority have their individual suite of services. All local authorities obviously have to collect residual and recycling, but how they do that does differ. So many of them will do commingled, whereas there are some local authorities who will do source segregation, so separate out fibres, paper like cans and bottles, that type of thing. Most of, probably about 2/3 of local authorities do collect separate food, and some do collect at the moment as mixed organics with garden waste, and there are a handful that don't collect food at all at the moment. And then again with garden waste services, some collect, some don't. So there is quite a variety, but in terms of this report, we did find that everybody managed to maintain, they had to maintain residual, and everyone pretty much maintained on the whole the recycling services, apart from a couple of boroughs which just just suspended them just for a few weeks. So it was mainly bulky waste and also garden waste where a lot of local authorities stopped those services as they were felt as less essential in order to get the more essential residual and recycling streams collected. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and then there's one final question that's coming through the chat. So before I begin, which is, are there any plans to do more London learnings for the second lockdown or any other learnings pieces? So I think that's probably a question for you, me, and pretty much everyone.
Yeah. Specifically for the London learnings one, there isn't any plans at the moment. Like I said, we did a very quick sort of basic sweep last week of the authorities to say, you know, what are happening with your services, and they're all running. We tend to know if services have stopped anyway, because we're in touch with all the local authorities. So I think we pretty much know what's going on, and I think we can see that this lockdown, local authorities are faring so much better than they did in the first lockdown. So not at the moment. Possibly if things start to change, if restrictions are in for longer, if there's a third lockdown, who knows? But no plans at the moment, not for the household side.
And I think it's worth saying, probably for everyone who's listening in here, obviously, is that we're coming, you know, up to December, and we'll get the waste data flow data for last year, which obviously won't include the lockdown data, but we also are talking to Jeff about whether or not we're able to get access. I think, you know, this isn't just for London, this is a national thing, to get access to some of that first 2 quarters data, or at least the first quarter data of this year, so that we can see how that compares to previous quarter data for that period. So we can really see what the impacts were and really get a true understanding of how waste tonnages changed for different sectors during the lockdown. So just to sort of wrap up and finish up, I hope that everyone who's been listening has found that useful and interesting. So just to finish up and say that the reports that we've spoken about are all available via our website. The link is shown there below. There's Kathy's London Learnings report, which is shown there on the far right, and then there is 2 reports there on commercial waste. So the first is a report which was conducted right at the end of lockdown, produced by Sarah, which looks at mechanisms and good practice that boroughs could implement in order to protect their commercial waste services. So looking at how to deliver flexible services to customers that had different waste and recycling needs than they would in normal economic conditions. And then the second one there being the report that Sarah has just presented on. And then also a reminder, Kathy touched on this, but on that same website are all of the digital resources that were produced by London Recycles. They're all still there, they're all still available. Some of them are obviously slightly out of date now, so the ones around household HWRCs reopening, but some of it is very much still there and usable and valuable. So, you know, the ones down bottom right, for example, on face masks and how to dispose of those correctly. And then a final reminder that the waste contingency, so for London boroughs, the waste contingency platform is still available and still available to everyone to look at and add questions, and still live with a number of different topic themes available there. So all that remains is for me to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you've all found it interesting. If you do have further questions or if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on, then please drop us an email either at info@lwarb.gov or info@resourcelondon.org.uk. Or if you know any one of us have our direct email addresses, then please do feel free to get in contact with us directly. Thanks very much. Stay safe in this current lockdown, and hopefully we will get to see many of you face to face in the next few months as measures begin to ease. Thanks very much.